You're listening to Frankly Speaking. I'm Frank Acom, and we're being joined by Charles Krause with the Center for Contemporary Political Art. He has an exhibit, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Portraits of Our Unindicted Leader, that opens on May 8th. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about your background in journalism. As a former Washington Post foreign correspondent, and we have a young reporter here who wins a lot of awards, and that's Rachel Madej, and she recently received a New York State Broadcasters Association award, so I thought maybe she could ask some in that field of journalism, if that's okay.
Well, Rachel, congratulations, by the way.
Well, thank you so much. So I was going to ask you about some of your past experiences covering the Guyana massacre, and I was wondering if you'd be comfortable talking about that.
Yes, I'm perfectly comfortable. I wrote a book about it, and I've talked about it many times, so yes,
and
I am.
I so admire your bravery to continue the coverage on that and documenting it after the traumatic events that happened on the airstrip. And I was wondering if during the congressman's visit, I know that one of the residents of Jonestown actually passed a note saying they wanted to leave, but before that, had you gotten the sense that something wasn't quite right there?
Yes, I was new to the story. I really, most of the other reporters were from California and were familiar with it. I wasn't, but when I got there, yes, I observed Jones, first of all, and I thought that he was clearly, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but, clearly he was unhinged, if you will, and I also noticed the first night that we were there that many of the residents of Jonestown who were at a concert, there was a music concert, and they were almost comatose. I just had the feeling that they were acting strangely, and I also, when I went to try to talk with some of them, I was stopped by the security people at Jonestown and told basically that I was not to talk to people, which I thought I certainly wanted to do and should be able to do. And instead I was kind of forced to go back to where I was and stay there through the concert. And so, yeah, there were signs before the final day that something was not quite right there.
I've really researched Jonestown a lot. I've watched many documentaries, but what I've never been able to find out is what transpired after you were shot. How did you end up getting to safety?
Well, what happened was that the incident, when they sent the assassination squad to the airstrip where we were in the process of boarding planes to leave, when it was all over, they left, and we were there. But the pilots of the two planes, one of the planes was disabled, so that plane couldn't fly. But the other one, the pilots got together and flew off all by themselves. They didn't take any of the wounded people. They didn't really make any effort to help us at all. But they flew back to Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, and that set off a series of events, including the White House called. They had recently passed some kind of national security legislation which set up an office so that should any member of Congress or government official be in danger, it triggered a series of responses. So by the next morning, the U.S. Marines had landed in Georgetown, in the capital of Guyana, and then after the Guyanese army entered the area where we were, the Marines started transporting us out of there in helicopters. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but that's sort of how we got out of there.
No, you did. Wow.
Charles Krause is our guest on Frankly Speaking. We're talking about Jonestown. You can read his book, The Guyana Massacre, The Eyewitness Account. Rachel had mentioned that there's a lot of documentaries and she's seen a lot of specials on Jonestown. What do you wish people knew about the events that transpired?
Well, I think, quite frankly, that religion and putting your faith in an individual is a dangerous sort of thing to do. I mean, people believe in God, they believe in the religion, and that's fine. But to put it in a human being who happens to be a religious leader, I think we have to be very careful about doing that. Setting up a false idol, perhaps. I mean, unfortunately, Catholic priests have abused their authority. Jim Jones certainly abused his authority. And I think we just have to be very careful about who we place our faith in, because sometimes that can be a big mistake. I would say this about Jim Jones. I don't think he started out, many years before Jonestown. I think he psychologically, I think the power, if you will, or went to his head, among other things, and he wasn't the same person at the end that he was at the beginning. But over the years, there were many, many horrible things that happened to the people in the People's Temple, but it was all hushed up for the most part, and it wasn't until he kind of took them to Guyana under false pretenses that things really got bad. And then, of course, we kind of arrived there, and that was kind of the final. I mean, I think that had we not arrived, something like that would have happened anyway, but, I think that, unfortunately, our being there kind of was what triggered the final act of murder and suicide, etc. But on the other hand, and I don't want to leave the impression, I think that the congressman went there in good faith. Some of his constituents were there. Some of his other constituents had asked him to go there to find out what was going on and to try to rescue people who didn't want to be there. So, I mean, it was just all a kind of very unfortunate set of circumstances that led to, what happened in Jonestown.
Former Washington Post foreign correspondent Charles Krause is our guest on Frankly Speaking. We now go back to WYDC TV reporter Rachel Madej.
Are you still in touch with any of the Jonestown survivors?
Yes, I am. Not on a regular basis, but from time to time, yes, I am.
Doing the research for this interview, I was surprised to learn that it was Flavor Aid and not actually the Kool-Aid brand that was used. But since this story is so personal to you, what is your feelings or what are your emotions when you hear people use the term drink the Kool-Aid?
Well, that pretty much came from my reporting, and that my reporting was based on what I was told by a couple of survivors, and there were a couple of survivors. There were a couple of people who I think were supposed to drink the Kool-Aid, but when they the potion, they called it Kool-Aid, and Kool-Aid is a kind of generic name like Kleenex. We call any kind of tissue sort of Kleenex, but not every tissue is Kleenex. And same thing with Kool-Aid. And in fact, I got a note from the president of the company, I forget which, that made Kool-Aid some weeks after Jonestown, who sort of very nicely said, well, we were happy to find out that it wasn't Kool-Aid, but we certainly understand why you might have, and they might have thought it was, and one thing or another. And so it wasn't a big deal, but it has entered the jargon, or it's a cliche or it's a saying now that, don't drink the Kool-Aid. And that sort of came from a quote from my first story, which said that they started with the babies and they drank the Kool-Aid, So that's where it kind of came from.
How did this affect your views of journalism when you went through all of this?
Well, I mean, it didn't, I thought I was there. We were there reporting a legitimate story. I don't know that it affected my views of journalism particularly. It affected my views of life because I was 30 years old at the time, and up until that time, like a lot of people, I hadn't really thought about death in a sense. But once you come that close to being killed, it kind of changes your perspective on things, and you kind of realize that you can't put off everything until tomorrow because tomorrow may never come. So, it did change my view of life to some extent. But it certainly didn't change my desire to be a journalist. I went on and spent the next 20 years being a journalist, and really loved every minute of it. So.
Charles Krause is our guest on Frankly Speaking. We now return to WYDC TV reporter Rachel Madej.
After Jonestown, when other cults would emerge, such as Waco or Heaven's Gate, did you have any interest in covering those events?
I didn't have any particular interest in covering them, and I made a decision right after when I got back from Jonestown and that I did not want to spend the rest of my journalistic career covering cults. So that was not what I wanted to do at all. I wanted to go back to Latin America, where I had just become the foreign correspondent, and report on Latin America. So I wasn't that I wanted to cover Waco or any of the other ones, but I did think that Waco in particular, I think that the authorities, it was unnecessary. I don't think, and I don't want to get into this really, I mean, I don't want to litigate this whole thing all over again. I do think that they didn't learn very much from Jonestown, and that could have been handled differently, and maybe all those people wouldn't have died. But, you know, I wasn't there, but that was my impression from far away.
Former Washington Post foreign correspondent and author of the Guyana massacre, the eyewitness account, Charles Krause is our guest. Let's talk for a moment about the Center for Contemporary Political Art. You have an exhibit coming up called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Portraits of Our Unindicted Leader. For someone that's interested in attending, what should they know about the exhibit?
Well, they should know that we have three artists who have different points of view, as we have people in the country who have different points of view. Artists have a way of expressing their points of view in visual language that can be it can be important and can help people understand a situation better. I think that if people see the exhibit, I mean, Julian's piece is 8 feet tall and 16 feet wide, and it's a huge piece. The other pieces are much, much smaller, but they too are very dramatic and I think are quite, important as well. And I think people should consider everything. They should, we tend to be polarized on the subject of Donald Trump, and we tend to, I don't know. I mean, people are set. People aren't willing to consider new information, and I think that they're basing their views on a lot of incorrect information. And I think that this exhibit will help if they look at everything. I think it will help them sort out what's true, what isn't true. I mean, certainly they'll see different opinions. Not that they won't have heard some of this or seen some of this before, but in one place it's a kind of, I think it's the first time that there has been an exhibit which put both pro and anti-Trump art together. So if nothing else, I have a chance to see it all in one place and come away with, I don't know if it'll change their minds about anything, but at least if they give it a good thought, if they think about it, at least it will cause them to think, and that's important, I think.
Charles Krause has been our guest this morning on Frankly Speaking. We've been talking The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Portraits of Our Unindicted Leader, which opens May 8th. Find out more at politicsartus.org, politicsartus.org. Charles, thanks so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun talking to you.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you, Rachel. I enjoyed it, and I hope people will come and see the exhibit.
And really, as a new journalist, it is so inspiring to talk to you, and it really raises my spirits.
Well, you know what? Journalism is a terrific profession, and it serves an enormously important purpose in our country. And for all of the talk about it being fake and about it being wrong and about journalists being biased and all the rest of it, I do think journalists do their best job, and most of them are, just looking to try to tell the story as it is, and I think it's a really important profession, so I hope you have a long and successful career doing it.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot.